Standing as we look at Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11 is where we're going to camp out this morning. Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. These are the holy, inerrant, and infallible words of the living God. On a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain and rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.' On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come and stand here.' And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, 'I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?' And after looking around at them all, he said to him, and after looking around at them all, he said to him, 'Stretch out your hand.' And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus." These are the holy, inerrant, and infallible words of the living God for the people of God. May you be seated. This is, for me, one of those texts that leaps off the pages because of the current moment I'm in my life. I shared a little bit with our team this morning as we were prepping and praying that very rarely has a text just kind of leaped off the page like this one in all of my 20 plus years of ministry because of where I am in life. But this one just jumped off the page, and its timeliness to my own soul and what I'm experiencing. And I pray for you as well. Let me ask you an honest question, right? And there's no pressure here. You don't have to answer it if you don't feel comfortable. But let me just ask you an honest question. Maybe you can just answer it amongst yourselves. Are you tired? Are you tired? It's a question I've had to reckon with in my own soul. Am I tired? And it's led me to a lot of decisions and a lot of dialogue with a lot of trusted men and women around in my life, and dialogue with my wife, dialogue with my brother pastor here at City Light. Just a reality of a tired soul. And I don't think I'm alone in this, right? I think this is a journey that many of us are faced with is the reality of fatigue, the reality of tired and weary souls. And so if you don't mind, I mean, this, I got my notes here. This is a 37-minute sermon. That's the way I kind of operate, where I know exactly how much time I got. So this is a 37-minute sermon. It may bleed out a little bit, but I want you to walk with me today because this is really important to me that I make sure we get this, okay? The text here that we have in front of us is a text in which we are being challenged by Jesus on what we think about the Sabbath. And upon your first read of this, you would think that it's saying something, and it is saying something that you may think that it's saying, but it's saying so much more than what you possibly think it's saying. In today's text, we have two Sabbaths. And these two Sabbaths are giving us two angles on two very important points. Two Sabbaths offering two angles on two very important points. And those two important points that we're getting these angles on are this. Number one, we need rest. And number two, we find rest only in Christ. We need rest, but we find rest only in Christ. Now, we just read a mouthful in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. So again, I want to kind of take our time and work through this. But let me tell you what you did not read as we read through Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. You did not read a call away from Sabbath rest. And that's the mistake that sometimes we make when we read these kind of texts where Jesus is on the Sabbath doing things and the Pharisees are critiquing him, and then we see that he kind of puts them in their place and we say, yep, there it is. So that just means I'm supposed to grind 7 days a week. That's not what you see in this text. In fact, in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus tells us that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Meaning that sometimes when we think, well, that just means I don't need it. It means the exact opposite. You do need it. It was made for you. So again, there's two things, there's these two Sabbaths that God is taking two angles to make 2 points. Number one, we need rest, and number two, only rest can be found in him. And how does he do this? Well, he takes these two angles to make these points. And these are the two angles that he takes. Number one, the Lord of the Sabbath makes a declaration that he is Lord of Sabbath. And then number two, the second angle is the Lord of the Sabbath demonstrates that he's the Lord of the Sabbath. So he declares that he's Lord of the Sabbath, but then he demonstrates that he's Lord of the Sabbath. All to point to the reality that we need rest, and rest can only be found in him. Does that make sense so far? So in verse 1, we hear on a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? As we've learned from the last 2 weeks that we've been preaching through the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 5, the Pharisees are like dogs to a bone when it comes to Jesus. They just will not stop looking for ways to discredit him, to trip him up, to show everybody that he is not somebody that they should align with. And here, like a dog to a bone, they are now following him. He is in the country. Understand this, he is in fields, in a rural place, and there are the Pharisees. Looking to see what is he going to do next? What are his disciples going to do next? They will not stop looking for ways to discredit him. One of the marks that you see sometimes in people enmeshed in legalism is a need to stay all in other people's business. Sometimes they can't be content with their own rule following. They must make sure that everybody else is towing the line of rules as well. And we see this in this particular bunch of religious elite. So what is the violation here? that the Pharisees are so worked up about? Well, the violation is not that they're going through the fields and picking up grain from neighbors' fields, because the Old Testament has already made provision for that. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 24 and 25, it says, if you go into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of the grapes, as many as you wish, but you shall not put any in your bag. In other words, don't get too comfortable in your neighbor's field. Pick up a few things here and there just to eat along the way, but not packing up stuff. Does that make sense? Some of y'all know how that feels, right? You invite people to your house to have a little party, have a little shindig, right? Before you know it, they packing up all the food. Wait, I didn't ask you to go in my refrigerator, right? Wait, all the food for y'all is out here. Does that make sense? Verse 25, it says, if you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears. This is Deuteronomy 23 and 25. You may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. So what we see in this text that the Pharisees are getting worked up about is not them just going in and plucking the grain. Rather, it's plucking the grain on the Sabbath. You see, on the Sabbath, there is supposed to be no work. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12, we hear God command us to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and on it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember, listen to this, that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. He says nobody works. There's a principle unpacked where he says nobody works. And what the Pharisees see is, wait a second, I think this looks like work. So keeping the Sabbath is the law, but it was a law that was so important that violating that law was punishable by death. Exodus chapter 35 and 2 says, 6 days work shall be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord, and whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. And in Numbers 15, we get an account of somebody. There is a man in a forest who's gathering sticks, and there are people that walk by, and bro, did you see? And they make a citizen's arrest now. They grab this man and they hold him. And then they take him to Moses and they say, Moses, we saw this man in the woods gathering sticks. What are we supposed to do? And Moses inquires of God. And God says, he has to die. He's killed, stoned for breaking the Sabbath. So here's the question, why on earth is this command so serious? Well, remember that this command was about covenant with God. You see, this command starts all the way back in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 2, God establishes all of this creation, and then he establishes this principle of rest. In creation, he creates for 6 days, and then he, on the seventh day, rest and pause. As we read in Exodus, we find this group of people, the children of Israel, in bondage in Egypt. And they were in bondage in such a way where they were being literally worked to death. And there was no opportunities for them to rest. And when they asked for rest, Pharaoh said, okay, I got you. No, we're gonna make it harder. And so now they've been delivered with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm out of the bondage of Egypt. And God delivers them. And so part of the weekly reminder that they belong to this God, this deliverer, was to gift them with the thing that they did not have, was rest, and the ability to rest, reflect, and worship. And every time they did it, they were reminded of who they belonged to. And every time they did it, they were reminded of who was truly great and who was truly inexhaustible. And it wasn't them, it was him. You see, the refusal to rest in worship was rebellion against the one who delivered them out of the bondage that wouldn't allow them to rest in worship. Does that make sense? So the refusal to rest in worship was rebellion against the one that delivered them out of the kind of bondage that wouldn't allow them to rest in worship. But refusal to rest in worship was also a subtle way of going back to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. In the fall of the garden, after God rested. And then in Genesis 3, we get two individuals who Satan, the tempter, comes along and says, did God really say? No, he just doesn't want you to be like him. He doesn't want you to be God. In other words, Sabbath, or not acknowledging it, was a subtle way of saying, I don't need him. I am capable of doing all of this on my own. I don't need to be dependent on anyone, including him. I can just work and work and work and work. So there was a lot of heaviness on this instruction. And as a result of all of this heaviness, you can imagine that there's a people who wanted to make sure that they were keeping this instruction. And this is where the Pharisees kind of come in. Because in the midst of hearing the instruction, you shall not work, it picked up this, they picked up on this and they said, we got to create laws to make sure that we do not work. And it started with the Mishnah, the Mishnah in the seventh book or seventh chapter of the Mishnah. It has this guidance about labor, about the Sabbath labor and what is labor. And there were 39 rules that were attached to Sabbath keeping as it relates to no labor. Don't sow, don't plow, don't reap, don't bind sheaves, don't thresh, don't winnow, don't select, don't grind, don't sift, don't knead, don't bake, don't shear wool, don't bleach it, don't hackle it, don't dye it, don't spin it, don't stretch the threads, don't make or mesh things together, don't weave two threads together, don't divide two threads, don't tie, don't knot, don't untie, and on and on and on. Don't capture a deer, don't slaughter a deer, don't flay a deer, don't salt it, don't cure it. All of these things were laid out to say, you don't do this because any of this is classified as work. And then the Pharisees said, all right, that's not enough. We got to add some stuff. And so then they added more to that. And so it went on and on and on and on and on. So what is happening here? What are the Pharisees seeing here in Jesus' disciples that's working them up? They don't see a violation in the disciples in the fields grabbing the grain. They see a violation of the Sabbath because in these fields on the Sabbath, the disciples are picking the head of the grain, which is harvesting in their minds, and threshing. Can't do that. That's a no-no. And then they're rubbing it in their hands, which is winnowing. You can't do that. That's a no-no. And then they are taking the kernel from that winnowing and then they're eating it, which is preparing it. And you can't do that. That's a no-no. So this is a violation on 3, possibly 4 counts for the Pharisees in their minds. And that's what they're worked up about. And Jesus says in verse 3, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him. How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. Just a quick observation here, but the disciples are the ones violating the law in the Pharisees' eyes. So the question is, why do the Pharisees take up their issue with Jesus? Well, the you in verse 2 is actually a plural you. It's a y'all for us. Does that make sense? And so they're addressing the whole audience, the whole company here when they say you. But in particular, they are zeroing in on Jesus, we can surmise, because Jesus is the leader of these disciples. They're saying, hey, look at your boys. What's going on here? What are you teaching them is what they're saying. So how does Jesus respond? Here's what he does. Or here's what he does not do. He does not try to make a case for why the Sabbath is not good. And he does not try to make a case for why the Sabbath is not useful. That's what he doesn't do. That's very, very important, by the way. But instead, what he does is he begins the work of redefining the purpose, the use, and the object of the Sabbath in the eyes of those who are questioning him. He starts with a story about David found in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, David is now on the run from King Saul. Saul has heard too much of the mixtape raps about David, right? You know what I mean? Where hey man, Saul killed this many, but man, David killed this many, right? And so Saul has heard enough of that, right? And so he's now saying, hey, David has to die. And so he has put a hit out on David. And so David is fleeing. But in the process of fleeing, one of the first things that happens is David has a moment at the temple where he and his men need bread. They need food. They need sustenance. And so they go to the priest and they say, hey, can we get some of that showbread? Can we get some of that bread from the table, from the tabernacle? Well, that's a no-no for a lot of reasons. This bread is made once a week and placed in the tabernacle on the golden table for Sabbath or every Sabbath. And then it's there. And when the batch that's replaced, or what do they do with the batch that's replaced? They take that batch and then they feed it to the priest, and only the priest. And so only the priests get an opportunity to eat from the bread that's being replaced. And nobody typically eats from the other bread. Well, David goes in because he and his men are on the run, and he talks to the priest and he says, can you give us some of the bread? And the priest blesses David and he gives him some of the bread. Ends up costing the priest his life. God doesn't kill him, Saul does for helping David. But it's a very important lesson that we're discovering in this text. Here, David, with the blessing of the priest, takes some of the bread and gives it to his men for survival, because David is God's anointed, and David is never condemned in Scripture for this act, because his survival of God's anointing was more precious to God than the bread itself. So here Jesus is now saying David, the anointed one, in his survival need was able to justify eating the bread. How much more so does the Lord, the greater David, the greater anointed one, over all have right to eat the grain on the Sabbath day? How much more so does he have not only right to eat the bread or eat the grain, but has right to allow his men, just like David allowed his? Does that make sense? Jesus is the greater David. But then we get in verse 5, which is really the meat of this entire passage, and it says, the Son of Man, Jesus says, is the Lord of the Sabbath. And what is he saying here? He's saying here, you're calling me to account, but you've missed the very point of all the laws that you uphold. What is the point? Well, the one that the bread in the temple pointed to has arrived. And the one that the Sabbath points to has arrived. The Lord of the Sabbath is here. Two observations here in this statement about the Lord of the Sabbath. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Observation number one, as the Lord of the Sabbath, I am above the Sabbath. Jesus is above the day. Jesus is not ruled or owned by the day. The day is ruled and owned by him. He sets the standards. He sets the order. He says what we can and cannot do on the day, not the Pharisees and their bonus list of rules. He does. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 5 through 7, we find an extended version of this very moment that we're reading about in Luke chapter 6. And we get a chance to hear a little bit more of Jesus' reasoning for why he does what he does here. He says this in verse in chapter 5 through 7, or chapter 12, verses 5 through 7, rather. And let me go back here. I'm sorry, guys. He basically says this, verse 5, or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. What is he saying there? He's pointing the Pharisees back to the reality that the priests in the temple have to work in the temple on the Sabbath. You see, on the Sabbath, the priests, they make burnt offerings, and on the Sabbath, they make grain offerings, and on the Sabbath, they do this service unto God, and they make drink offerings more than any other day during the week. And he says, they're not charged with violating the law for their service to God and their service to the temple on that day. And then he says, something greater than the temple has arrived. And so if they are not charged for their service and their labor in the temple, then how much more so will I not be charged when the Lord of the Sabbath has arrived? You allowed for license for the priests to prepare worship and to prepare service in the temple. But standing in front of you is one that it all points to, is what Jesus is saying. So that's one thing he's saying in his statement. I am the Lord of the Sabbath, meaning I am over the Sabbath. But here's another thing that I believe he's saying. It's this: as the Lord of the Sabbath, everyone finds their rest in me. As the Lord of the Sabbath, everyone finds their rest in me. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have different ways in which they capture this moment that we're reading about. Mark captures it this way. He says in verse 23 through 28, he talks about this plucking of the grain and how the Pharisees pick up on that and say, what are you doing? And all of that kind of stuff. And then he talks about the fact that David went in and got the showbread, or the bread of presence, and he gave it to his men that were with him to eat. And then he says in verse 27, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Here Jesus is saying, in your quest to add more rules to make sure everyone keeps the Sabbath day of rest, you have made the Sabbath day a burden. And you've ultimately lost its very purpose. The Sabbath was made for men to rest and to have their hearts point back to God. That's what the Sabbath is for. That's what the principle is for you to rest, reflect, and to have your hearts pointed back to God on a routine weekly basis. The Sabbath was made to lead men and women back to me, Jesus is saying. And in making the day so demanding and so meticulous, you've emptied it of its meaning, its significance, and its focus. The Sabbath wasn't meant to be a burden to man. It was meant to be a reminder that in God they have rest, in me they have rest. And so some of you guys, in thinking about a principle for Sabbath, have thought about the principle of Sabbath in the same way that the Pharisees have tried to use the Sabbath. You've thought about it burdensome. And in thinking about it as burdensome, you've avoided it. And in avoiding it, you've created weary hearts. So here in verses 1 through 5, he declares it. Then immediately in verses 6 through 11, we get the chance to see him demonstrate it. Now that was all the meat of this. I'm going to deal real quickly with verses 6 through 11. So let's jump down there. It says, on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and he was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him. Just imagine this picture. Just imagine this picture. They're watching Jesus to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come and stand here. And the man rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to destroy it? What does a withered hand look like, one may ask? Withered hand can take on the shape almost as if the hand is shriveling and shrinking because it's losing its muscular form and density, its strength and its power. And it's losing that strength and its power due to some sort of ailment or condition. In fact, rheumatoid arthritis left untreated or in severe cases, has the possibility of creating that kind of result. And many of you in the room know that Candy, my own wife, suffers from rheumatoid arthritis. So this really hits home for me. It's not just my wife suffers from rheumatoid arthritis, my mom suffers from arthritis, and so these things are real for me. But it's not just the appearance that you need to consider in conditions like these, though. It's oftentimes the severe pain that too often accompanies these types of conditions. See, there are many days in the life of my own spouse and in the Crawford home where I simply have to massage her hands because of the condition of rheumatoid arthritis that she battles with. Right now in our kitchen is a box of mini heating packs that she can take out and shake them, and then they begin to warm up, and she keeps them around in her pockets so that she can put her hands in her pockets to keep her hands warm, because the cold can have a debilitating impact on her whole body. So this is a man I don't know, but I understand to some degree because I watched it. Does that make sense? However, this man is experiencing this condition in antiquity, which means a few more things. You see, his condition is far worse than what we would typically see because he doesn't have the miracle and the provision of modern medicine. He doesn't have the provision and the miracle of modern science to keep at bay the worst effects of whatever condition he is suffering from. And his condition has a huge sociological impact in his time, because many people would look at his condition and look at his time and look at what he's suffering from, and they would say, that's a man to be avoided, versus that's a man that needs our attention and needs our love. So here's the point. Of all the people standing around in the synagogue, in this public scene, in this moment, here was a man most in need of rest. This was a man that was probably looking for rest. This man, without question, needed rest. But because the Pharisees didn't truly understand the source of rest, they were willing to deny this man rest from the only person in the only place that he could receive rest. And they were willing to do it in the name of rest. In Luke chapter 6, verse 7, we see that the Pharisees were more concerned about the day that Jesus was going to do this miracle rather than the power that it took to do the miracle. They were more concerned about the day of rest than actually giving someone rest. You see, when our hearts are poisoned by legalism, our hearts are soured by self-righteousness, we miss opportunities to give rest. We miss opportunities to behold the wonder and the work of God. They're too poisoned to see what God is doing in their midst. Have you seen this before? Absolutely, you've seen this before. I've seen the Lord awaken hearts of men and women. And instead of celebrating the work that God has done, I've seen the first thing Christians notice is the clothes that are on their back. I've seen them pay attention to their shoes. I've seen them pay attention to their hair. I've seen them pay more attention to their presentation. I've seen them pay more attention to the robes that are on their physical body than the robes that have now been clothed over their spiritual bodies. The white robes that have replaced the tarnished and dark ones. You see, when our hearts are poisoned by legalism and self-righteousness, we miss opportunities to behold the wonder and the work of God. What opportunities has your self-righteousness caused you to miss? I know my self-righteousness has caused me to miss some. What work has God been doing around you that you can't focus on because you're too focused on how your commitment to your preferences makes you more righteous than those who are not committed to yours? In verse 8, we hear that he knew their thoughts, even as they were just articulating it within their souls. He knew their thoughts. And so he called this man, and he called him, and he said, "Get up and stand here." And so he rose, and he stood there. Jesus forced him to face the hurt. Jesus forced him to face the restlessness of this man. And he said, "Are you going to permit me To leave this man restless on the day of rest in the name of rest? Very often we try to put hurt out of our vision so it won't disrupt the work of our self-righteousness. Very often we try to put hurt out of our vision so it won't disrupt our pride. Very often we try to put hurt out of our vision so it won't disrupt our careless attitudes to those that are broken, those that are restless, those that are hurting. However, Jesus in this moment would not allow it. He put him front and center. He said, hey, look at this man and look at his hand. What do you think I should do about this? There are times when we have to ask ourselves, are we married to our rules or married to our God? Our God sends us out to mend the wounds of the brokenhearted. And so when an opportunity to do good is placed in front of us, be careful not to ignore it in the name of doing God's work. You see, I'm deathly afraid that there are times in which we reject the people that the kingdom has come to reach in the name of serving the kingdom. And we have to wrestle with that tension. But the Lord would not fall in that trap with the Pharisees. And so in verse 10 it says, after looking around at them all, he said to them, or said to him, stretch out your hand. And he did so. And his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Now this word fury is actually, it means abnormal, mindless rage. They were outdone with the fact that a restless man was able to receive rest for once in his life on the day of rest. You see, sometimes our hatred for one thing can cause us to ignore and miss the beauty of God in another thing. They despised Jesus so much that they couldn't celebrate the life and blessing on display in the healing of a man who suffered incredible and immense agony from his condition. But that's not the biggest point in this text. The biggest point in this text was that in Christ, the rest had come. This man searched all of his life for rest. And I'm sure he obliged and obeyed the Sabbath laws and customs. And yet, it was only until he met Jesus that he found it. The Lord of the Sabbath was declared in the fields. Remember in the fields, he says, hey, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. But the Lord of the Sabbath was displayed and demonstrated in the synagogue with this man. What do we learn from all of this? Here's the lesson I really want you to walk away with as you leave today. Rest is not in law keeping, Jesus is saying. Rest is in me. Rest is in me. We need rest. But see, here's our fallen condition, is that we need it, but oftentimes we look for it in every other place besides God. And so, as we see with the mindless rage of the Pharisees, because we are looking for it in so many other places, sometimes we are willing to fight for it, claw, beg, borrow, steal, kill, to keep ourselves from turning to the one who will actually give it to us. You see, Sabbath was created to provide our bodies rest and create space for us to reflect over and over on where our souls find rest. That's why Sabbath was created, for us to remember, for us to set aside time on a regular basis to remember that my rest is found in God, not in my law keeping. The Pharisees were missing this satisfaction of the soul because they were too caught up in their forms of self-established holiness. They were adding laws and constraints, even at the cost of moments of survival or moments of goodness, like we see with this man with this withered hand. And they were missing the point that God was where they take their ultimate rest, not in themselves and not in their rule following. However, before we dismiss the Pharisees, before we dismiss them, let's take a moment to acknowledge our own shortcomings. let's acknowledge that there is another problem that many of us are susceptible to as we think about rest, me included. You see, the modern man and the modern woman miss our opportunity to experience satisfaction of the soul, not because of our self-created Sabbath laws. We miss it because we reject any constraint at all on Sabbath. We say, hey, Jesus said we're free from this, and so now it's time to work and do and work. We never stop. For the Pharisees, they stopped in this very unrealistic and constrained way in the name of rule keeping, because that's where they found their satisfaction in being seen holier than thou. But for us, we never stop because we are always seeking to achieve something, believing that achievement will bring us rest and satisfaction of the soul. You see, we're looking at different places, but we're still looking for rest. And this too is a false pursuit and abuse of the Sabbath principle. One of the reasons this pursuit has become so prominent is because of the age that we're in. You see, our culture has conditioned us to overwork. We have the hustle culture mindset where basically society is increasingly glorifying constant productivity and busyness. Ask anybody in this room, what have you been up to lately in the last few days? What are you gonna say? Man, I just been busy. Just been busy, bro. Just been busy, dog. Just been busy, sister. Just been busy, mama. Just been busy, daddy. Everybody in the room is gonna say that they've just been busy if you ask them, what have you been up to? How often do you hear anybody say, when you say, what have you been up to? Man, just resting in the Lord. That's the society, that's the culture that we're in. We're in a society and culture of blurred work-life boundaries. You see, with the advancement of remote work and remote technology and mobile work, now you can work from anywhere, which means you work from everywhere. There's the fear of job insecurity and livelihood because the separation from the top and the bottom continues to increase. The competition in the bottom and the middle continues to intensify. So now you're just telling yourself, I gotta work, more, and more. And then you pick up your phone and you look at social media and you see somebody that's in Costa Rica and you're like, man, I wanna go there. I wanna go to Costa Rica one day. And so what do? Man, I gotta get back to work. But ultimately, above all those reasons, the reason why we overwork, the reason why I overwork, is because we have convinced ourselves publicly, privately, or even subconsciously that in our achievement, we will find rest. We keep telling ourselves that when we get to that point, then my soul will be happy. And then we get to that point and we say, well, if I get to this next point, then my soul will be happy. And then we get to that point, well, if I get to that next point, then my soul will be happy. You see, some of us reject the Pharisees' counsel in this text not because we ultimately desire rest in Christ, but rather because our rejection of their way makes room for us to continue trying to rest in what we accomplish. So we trade in the Pharisees' excessive additions to God's instruction to rest for an excessive understanding of God's instruction to work. That's all we're doing. Trading in one for the other. So all of us, both the Pharisee and us, are searching for rest. But we are just looking for it in ourselves. And in so doing, our souls are wearier than they've ever been. We're tired. But to find deep and true rest, you must look not to yourself, not to your stern rule keeping on the Sabbath, not to your relentless pursuit of accomplishments because you refuse to observe a Sabbath, but to Christ, who calls us all to pause and reflect on the reality that he is enough. We and the Pharisees are in the same ditch. We're just on different ends of it. We misuse the Sabbath by missing the Lord of the Sabbath. In him is where our soul's rest will be found. Not in the tedious rule keeping of the Sabbath in search of soul satisfaction, and neither in our unhealthy pursuit of accomplishments in search of soul satisfaction. We find soul satisfaction when we turn to him. And when we turn to him, we no longer have to try and find rest in our nitpicking rule keeping. But also when we turn to him, we no longer have to try and find rest in our endless list of accomplishments. I don't know what that looks like for you. You see, here's the thing about having freedom in Christ is that Sabbath can take on different approaches. But let me assure you, you need a Sabbath. And that Sabbath needs to be a time and a period of nothingness where you just stop, pause, and reflect on the reality that nothing that I accomplish can draw me any closer to you. I've received you because of who you are and what you've done. And your soul just needs to pause and reflect on that. And you need a period of time in that same day, in that same minute, where you pause and reflect on the reality that I am not God, you are. And so it doesn't matter if I work 7 days a week. It will never be enough. And so let me stop and recognize my humanness before a holy God. And recognize that you're the one that's in control, not me. Me working 7 days isn't going to give my life any more control than me stopping and turning my life over to you and pausing on the seventh. That's what we need. You know, in Hebrews 4, Jesus tells us, or the author tells us, that Christ is our rest. He says there is yet a Sabbath that remains. But the Sabbath is no longer found on a particular day or a minute or an hour, but rather the Sabbath is found in a person. And we need that person so that our souls can find rest. I told you I was going to be a little long this morning, but this is what I want you to do. I want you to really and truly stop and pause and ask yourself, how can I relinquish control to God? In what ways can I stop trying to be God? In what ways can I trade achievement over to satisfaction and instead pick up rest in God for satisfaction? I can tell you right now, the reason why this text is so prominent to me is because that work is happening in my heart right now. And it's been happening for several months. And I want to encourage you to take on that similar work because I love you. Because I love you. And I want to hear more than just testimonies of fatigue. And we can't get there without first pausing and observing that we serve the Lord of the Sabbath, and it is only in him that we find our true rest. Let me pray for you.